My family cut me off, but when I got the house, they broke in and tried to steal it. The first time I realized my parents didn't love me the way they loved my brother, I was 6 years old. It was late autumn. My brother, Daniel, and I were playing in the backyard. While he was playing, I was mostly trying to keep up. Daniel was 2 years older, taller, faster, and, as I would eventually understand, their favorite. That day, he was showing off his new red bicycle. It was a birthday gift from our parents, a sleek, expensive thing with shiny black tires and a bell that rang out sharp and clear whenever he flicked it. He rode it in circles around the yard while I stood off to the side, hands shoved into the pockets of my too-thin jacket, watching. "Come on," he called over his shoulder. "Bet you can't catch me." I ran after him, stumbling over my own feet. I wasn't clumsy, but I was smaller, my legs not nearly as fast as his. He laughed as I tripped, sending me sprawling onto the cold ground. My knee scraped against a patch of rough concrete near the driveway, and I felt the sting before I saw the blood. I remember looking up, expecting, hoping that my mom or dad would rush over. That's what parents do, right? They pick you up, brush you off, tell you everything's okay. But when I turned my head toward the porch, my mother was still sitting in her chair, flipping through a magazine. My father was focused on Daniel, nodding approvingly as my brother wove the bike between the trees at the edge of our yard. Nobody even noticed I had fallen. So I picked myself up, bit down on my lip, and wiped my bleeding knee with the sleeve of my hoodie. That was the first time I understood something that would take years to fully accept. In our family, I was an afterthought. Daniel was everything to them. Even as a child, he had this effortless charm, a way of making people smile, of making them want to be around him. He had my dad's easy confidence, my mom's striking looks, and an energy that drew people in. It wasn't just my parents who adored him. It was everyone. Teachers, neighbors, family, friends. And then there was me, the one who didn't quite fit. I wasn't awkward, just unnoticed. Our childhood home had picture frames lining the walls, and if you look closely, the imbalance was obvious. Dozens of photos of Daniel. I was there somewhere in the background, slightly out of focus, like an afterthought in my own family album. I used to wonder if they even realized how differently they treated us. Like the Christmas when Daniel got a brand new game console, the latest sneakers, and a stack of neatly wrapped gifts. I got socks and a book about dinosaurs, something I'd been interested in 3 years earlier. When I hesitated after unwrapping it, my mother gave me a disapproving look. "Don't be ungrateful," she said, her voice sharp. "Your father and I worked hard for these gifts." I nodded quickly. I had learned by then that there was no point in complaining. That was always the way of things. The only person who ever really saw me was my grandmother. She was my father's mother, but they couldn't have been more different. Where my father was rigid and unsmiling, grandmother was warm, sharp-witted, and full of a quiet kind of defiance that I admired even before I was old enough to put it into words. She had this way of looking at me, really looking like she could see straight through all the ways I try to make myself smaller, to take up less space. One summer, I was staying at her house for a few days. She lived in a big home, the kind with floral wallpaper and bookshelves overflowing with novels she had read a dozen times. I liked it there, it felt safe. One evening, as I sat on the couch flipping through a comic book, she glanced up from her knitting and said, "They don't deserve you, you know." I looked up confused. "Who?" She gave me a knowing smile. "Your parents." I didn't know what to say to that. "They're blind," she continued, setting her knitting aside. "They see what they want to see. And right now, all they see is your brother." She reached for her tea, took a slow sip. "But one day, that's going to change." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But I'd already learned not to get my hopes up. The years passed, and the gap between us all only grew wider. Daniel became the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. If he got in trouble at school, it was waved off as just boys being boys. If he flunked a class, they hired a tutor without a second thought. Me? I was expected to figure things out on my own. By the time I was in high school, I had stopped trying. I still did well in school. Not because they expected me to, but because I wanted to prove to myself that I could. But I didn't bother trying to win their approval anymore. It wasn't worth the effort. The only time my dad really spoke to me was to compare me to Daniel. "Your brother was captain of the soccer team at your age," he'd remind me. "You should be doing something." I was. I had a job. I got good grades. I was making plans for my future. But none of that mattered to him. Because I wasn't Daniel. And in his eyes, That meant I would never be enough. The day I turned 18, nothing really happened. No party, no cake, no warm words of encouragement. What did happen, though, was a quiet but undeniable shift in the air. My father didn't say the words outright, but his meaning was clear. You're an adult now. You're on your own. A week after my birthday, I came home from work to find that my bedroom had been turned into a storage space. My mattress was gone, my dresser shoved into the garage. Boxes of old decorations and seasonal junk had taken my place. When I confronted my parents, my father had just shrugged. You're going to move out soon anyway, he said. It wasn't a question. It was an expectation, and I got the message loud and clear. So, I moved out. At first, it almost felt freeing. I found a tiny one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. Cheap, cramped. I worked long shifts at a warehouse, the pay barely covering rent and food, but I managed. For a while, I told myself I didn't care. So what if my parents never checked in? So what if Daniel never texted me, never asked how I was doing? I was used to it. But then, things started to fall apart. It started with a few bad weeks at work. Hours got cut. A couple of unexpected expenses piled up. A car repair, a higher than usual utility bill. My savings, already thin, drained faster than I could replace them. Rent was due in 5 days, and for the first time in my life, I felt something close to panic. No safety net. And despite everything, despite years of knowing better, I did something I swore I'd never do. I called my parents for help. I sat in my car outside my apartment, my phone pressed to my ear, heart pounding in a way that made me hate myself. The line rang twice before my father picked up. What? He said, skipping right past hello. I swallowed my pride. I need some help, I said. Just this once. Things have been tight, and I just need a little help covering rent. I'll pay you back. A sharp exhale cut me off. Are you serious? I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I wouldn't ask if I wasn't. There was a long pause. Then, in the background, I heard Daniel's voice. Muffled at first, then clearer as he took the phone from my father. Wait, you're asking for money? He laughed. A full, genuine, amused laugh. Jesus, man, that's pathetic. You moved out, what, a year ago? And you're already begging for help. I'm not begging. You kind of are. Daniel sighed dramatically. Listen, man, I'd love to help, but, I actually work for my money. Maybe you should try that instead of running back to mommy and daddy the second things get hard. I wanted to hang up. I should have, but I couldn't stop myself from asking. They're helping you, though, aren't they? And there it was. Of course they were. I had heard the rumors. My father was bankrolling Daniel's business venture, some gym. My brother had never struggled a day in his life. He didn't have to. He had them. I took a breath, forced my voice to stay even. I'll figure it out myself. Daniel snorted. Yeah, good luck with that. The line went dead. And that was that. I sat there for a long time, the phone still in my hand, staring at nothing. I should have been angry, furious, something. But all I felt was tired. It was stupid of me to expect anything different. I shoved my phone into my pocket and stared out at the empty street. I had 5 days to figure something out. I had no help, no support, but there was one person I could still turn to. The only person who had ever given a damn about me. My grandmother. I hadn't spoken to my grandmother in a while. Not because I didn't want to, but because life had a way of keeping me too busy, too tired, too caught up in the struggle of just getting by. But I knew that if I knocked on her door, she wouldn't turn me away. So, that's exactly what I did. Her house hadn't changed. It was the same weathered place I remembered from childhood, the one with a wide front porch and the wind chimes that clinked softly in the evening breeze. The scent of her garden, jasmine and lavender, hung in the air. For a moment, standing there, I almost felt like a kid again. Like maybe I'd step inside and everything would go back to the way it was when I was younger, when her house was the only place that ever felt like home. I knocked. The door opened a few seconds later, and there she was, my grandmother. She didn't ask why I was there, didn't question the look on my face, the exhaustion in my posture. She just reached out, took my hand, and pulled me into a hug. Come in, she murmured. We sat in her kitchen, the same kitchen where she had once taught me how to make tea, how to bake cookies, how to sit in silence without it feeling awkward. I didn't want to ask for help. Didn't want to be that person, the one who came running only when they needed something. But she knew. She always knew. She took a sip of her own tea, then set it down with a quiet clink. What happened? And just like that, the dam broke. I told her everything. About my apartment, about work, about calling my parents, about the way my father brushed me off, the way Daniel had laughed at me. Her expression was unreadable at first, but then she let out a long, slow sigh. I knew they'd turn their backs on you, she murmured, but I thought they'd at least pretend to care for a little longer. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I was stupid to even call them. No, she said firm. You weren't. They were stupid not to help you. The quiet rage in her voice startled me. She shook her head, muttering something under her breath that I didn't catch. Then, she looked back at me. You'll stay here, she said simply. For as long as you need. I blinked. Grandma, I can't. You can, she interrupted. And you will. You stay here. The hold's tight. I don't want to be a burden. You're not. Simple as that. Moving in with her was an adjustment. I wasn't used to quiet. My apartment had always been filled with noise. The hum of the fridge, the distant sound of my neighbors arguing through paper-thin walls, the occasional sirens screaming through the night. But here, the only sounds were the soft rustling of leaves outside, the occasional creak of the old house settling, and my grandmother humming as she worked in the kitchen. At first, it felt unnatural, too still. Then slowly, it became comforting. I found work again, a better job, one that paid enough to give me a little breathing room. My grandmother never made me feel like I owed her anything, but I still helped where I could. I ran errands, fixed things around the house, made sure she never had to lift anything heavy. And for the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving. I was living. A year later, I moved out. Not because I had to. Grandma had made it clear I could stay as long as I wanted, but because I was finally stable enough to be on my own again. I found a decent place. A small but comfortable apartment in a better part of town. I had a steady job, enough savings to keep me afloat. I was even making plans for the future. Real plans, the kind I never thought I'd be able to afford. I visited Grandma every Sunday for dinner. We never really talked about the time I had stayed with her. She never made a big deal about it. She had just been there when I needed her, the way she always was. And I thought that was it. I thought the chapter had closed. I had no idea what was coming. When my grandmother passed away, it was sudden. A stroke. I got the call while I was at work. The funeral was small and quiet. My parents were there, and Daniel was there too. But I had no contact with them. I grieved alone. Then a few weeks later, I got another call. From her lawyer. Sitting in that office, listening to the words coming out of his mouth, I felt like I had fallen into someone else's life. Your grandmother left everything to you, the lawyer said. I blinked. I'm sorry, what? The house. The estate. All of her savings. It's all been left in your name. I sat there, my brain struggling to catch up. I had expected, I don't know, maybe some sentimental things. Maybe a little money, enough to cover some bills. But everything? Are you sure? I asked, my voice strangely hoarse. The lawyer slid a thick folder across the desk. Your grandmother was very clear in her wishes. I stared down at the paperwork, my hands shaking. And then, the door burst open. And suddenly, I wasn't alone. My parents, Daniel, and judging by the looks on their faces, they were furious. I felt my stomach drop, because in that moment, I realized something. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The room was silent for a moment. Then my mother scoffed a sharp, disbelieving sound. This has to be a mistake. The lawyer didn't even blink. It's not. I barely heard him. My mind was still struggling to process what had just happened. My grandmother left me everything. Not just a little money. Not just some keepsakes. Everything. I had walked into this office expecting nothing. Maybe a small inheritance, maybe a few things she wanted me to have. But this? I could feel my father's glare burning into me. His fist clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white. Daniel was the first to break the silence. This is bullshit, he snapped, stepping forward. His voice was sharp, angry, but underneath it, I could hear something else. Panic. She wouldn't do this, he continued, turning to the lawyer like he was waiting for him to agree. She wouldn't just cut us out like that. The lawyer flipped through a few pages, his expression completely neutral. She had a new will drawn up last year. It was properly signed and witnessed. It is legally binding. My mother shook her head, looking offended, like someone had just slapped her across the face. She must have been confused, she said quickly. She was old. Maybe she wasn't in her right mind when she did this. The lawyer gave her a cold look. She was very clear in her decisions. She knew exactly what she was doing. I felt a strange, shaky exhale leave my body. She chose me. She had seen how they treated me my whole life. She had known, and she had made sure, in the end, that I was the one who got out on top. For a brief moment, something in me ached. I wish she were still here, that I could thank her, that I could tell her she didn't have to do this for me. But then, Daniel laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "Oh, I get it now," he said, shaking his head. "You manipulated her." I snapped my gaze to him. "What?" His smirk was cruel. "You knew she was getting older. You moved in with her, played the sweet little grandson, made her pity you." I shot up from my chair. "That's not what happened." But he just kept talking, his voice rising. "You took advantage of her, didn't you? Convinced her to change her will. She offered to help me." I snapped, "when I had nowhere else to go. None of you gave a damn about me, remember? I didn't even know she changed her will." Daniel scoffed. "Yeah, sure." I turned to my parents. "You're really going to believe this? You know what she was like. She wouldn't have done this unless she wanted to." My father said, "She was old. So that's the excuse?" I asked. "She was fine when she was buying you Christmas gifts, when she was lending you money. But now, because she left it all to me, suddenly she was confused?" Neither of them answered, because they knew I was right. But that didn't mean they were going to accept it. The meeting ended in tension. The lawyer explained the details, how the estate would be transferred into my name, how the accounts would be settled. My parents didn't say another word. But Daniel? He glared at me the entire time. I knew that look. I had seen it 100 times when we were kids, whenever he didn't get his way. Except this time, it wasn't a toy or a game he was mad about. It was everything, and as I walked out of that office, I had a sinking feeling. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I had barely been home an hour before the phone call started. At first, I ignored them. I wasn't in the mood for whatever my parents or Daniel had to say. But after the fourth missed call, my curiosity got the better of me. I answered. The moment I put the phone to my ear, my mother's sharp voice cut through the line. "You have no right to that money. No breathing." Just straight to the venom. I let out a slow breath, gripping the phone tighter. "I didn't take anything. Grandma left it to me." "You heard the lawyer." "She wasn't in her right mind," she snapped. "You must have pressured her. There's no other reason she would do this." I said, "I didn't pressure her. I didn't even know she changed her will." "She wouldn't do this to us," my mother continued, her voice rising. "She wouldn't. But she did. I wanted to say. She chose me. For once in my life, someone in this family chose me over Daniel." I didn't say that, though. I knew it would only make things worse. Instead, I asked the one thing I had been wondering since the moment they stormed into that lawyer's office. I pushed forward. "You didn't visit her. You didn't check in on her. But now that there's money involved, suddenly you're concerned?" My mother made a noise of frustration. "She was our family, not just yours. She was my family when I needed her." I shot back. "Where were you when I needed help?" For a brief second, I thought maybe she actually felt ashamed. Then her voice turned cold. "If you don't do the right thing and give Daniel his share, you'll regret it." I almost laughed. "Are you threatening me?" "It's not a threat," she said smoothly. "It's a warning." I didn't give her the satisfaction of a response. I just hung up. 3 days later, Daniel showed up at my door. I had barely cracked it open when he pushed his way inside, his cologne strong enough to choke me. He looked furious. "We need to talk." I folded my arms. "We already did." Daniel scoffed, shaking his head. "You're playing with fire, man. You really think you deserve everything? The house, the money? Be honest. What have you done to deserve any of it?" I said, "Grandma thought I did." Daniel's lips curled into a sneer. "Yeah, well, Grandma isn't here anymore, is she?" I clenched my fists. I wanted to hit him for everything he had ever done, every time he had belittled me, every time he had made me feel like I was nothing. But I didn't, because that's what he wanted. Instead, I stepped back and gestured toward the door. "Get out." Daniel didn't move. Not at first, but then his smirk returned, slow and mocking. "All right," he said, but before stepping outside, he glanced back over his shoulder. "You're going to regret this." And then he was gone. I locked the door behind him, and for the first time, a very real sense of unease settled into my chest. Because I believed him. I should have changed the locks. I don't know why I didn't. Maybe some part of me still believed they wouldn't go that far. That as entitled and manipulative as my parents and Daniel were, they wouldn't actually cross the line. I was wrong. It was late, past midnight, when I woke up to the sound of the front door unlocking. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then I heard the creak of the door opening, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps inside the house. For a second, my brain struggled to catch up. No one else had a key. No one should be inside. But someone was. And then, before I could even process what was happening, the bedroom light switched on. I bolted upright. And there they were. My parents, Daniel, standing in my bedroom like they had every right to be there. I scrambled out of bed, heart pounding. "What the hell are you doing here?" I demanded. Daniel smirked. "Well, technically this is still our house." "It's mine." My father stepped forward, arms crossed. "That's exactly what we need to talk about." I glanced at my mother. She was watching me with that same cold, calculating look she always had when she wanted something. "You're going to sign over the house," she said smoothly. "You stay here? Stunt." "You're joking." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "This house belongs to our family. Your grandmother had no right to take it away from us." I let out a short, disbelieving laugh. She owned it. She had every right. "She was old," my father said. "She wasn't thinking clearly. And you took advantage of that." I said, "That's bullshit." Daniel took a step closer, and that's when I noticed the folder in his hands. Papers. Legal documents. They had come prepared. They really thought they could force me to just hand everything over. I shook my head. "Not happening." My father sighed like I was being difficult. "We're not asking." And that's when I noticed something else. Daniel had closed the bedroom door behind him. I wasn't just being pressured. I was trapped. I took a slow step back, my pulse hammering. "You broke into my house," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "Do you really think this is going to end well for you?" Daniel smirked. "It'll end fine as long as you cooperate. Just sign the damn papers," my father added. "And we'll leave." I glanced at my mother. She wasn't saying much, but I could see the determination in her expression. They actually thought they could intimidate me into giving up everything. But they underestimated me. They always had. I took a slow breath. Then I moved, not toward the papers, not toward them, but toward my phone still sitting on my nightstand. Before they could react, I snatched it up and immediately dialed. The moment I hit 911, I turned the screen toward them. Daniel's smirk vanished. "You serious?" he snapped. "Yeah, I am," I said. A voice crackled through the speaker. 911. "What's your emergency?" I stared Daniel down as I spoke. "There are intruders in my home," I said, loud and clear. "They broke in and are refusing to leave." My father's face darkened. "You have about 5 minutes before the cops get here," I interrupted. "Maybe less." I tilted my head. "Unless you'd like to explain to them why you're trespassing and attempting to extort me." Daniel opened his mouth, then snapped it shut. I could see it the moment they realized they had lost. But then, my mother crossed her arms, lifting her chin. "We're not leaving. We're not leaving," she repeated, her voice firm. "This is our house. We have every right to be here. And when the police arrive, they'll see that this is just a family disagreement." Daniel's smirk returned. "Yeah, you really think they're going to arrest Mom and Dad?" I swallowed, suddenly unsure. Would they? Would the cops actually do anything? Or would they just brush it off as some kind of domestic dispute? The minutes crawled by in thick silence. Then sirens. A sharp blue light flickered against the windows. A knock at the door. "This is the police." "Open up. I'll let them in." The officers, 2 of them, a man and a woman, stepped inside, surveying the scene. My parents straightened up, putting on their best concerned faces. "Thank God you're here," my mother said, stepping forward. "There's been a misunderstanding." The male officer glanced at me. "You're the one who called?" "Yes." My voice was steady, even though my heart was still pounding. "They broke into my house and refused to leave." My father let out a dramatic sigh. "This is his house." He gestured to me like I was some random stranger. "Officer, this is a family home. We've lived here for years." He's just confused. "This house is legally mine," I cut in. "I inherited it, and they have no right to be here." The officers exchanged glances. Then the female officer turned to my parents. "Did you break in?" My mother gave a soft, disbelieving laugh. "We used to live here. We still have a key. How is that breaking in?" The officer nodded slowly. "And were you asked to leave?" My father clenched his jaw. "We were just talking." "Yes or no, sir?" Silence. The officers turned serious. "Then this is trespassing," the male officer said. "And if you refuse to leave now, we'll have to remove you by force." My mother's face twisted in anger. "You're going to arrest us? For visiting our own son?" The female officer didn't flinch. "You've been given a lawful order to leave the premises. I suggest you follow it." For a second, I thought my father was going to refuse. Then, with a sharp inhale, he turned on his heel. "Let's go." Daniel gave me one last, heated look before following. The officers gave me some advice. Change the locks, consider getting a restraining order. And just like that, they were gone. I stood there for a long time after they left, my hands still trembling. The morning after the break-in, I did exactly what the police had advised. I changed the locks, installed security cameras, and made sure there was no way they could pull that stunt again. A week later, I got served with legal papers. They were suing me. The lawsuit accused me of manipulating my grandmother into changing her will. According to them, she had been mentally unfit in her final years, and I had taken advantage of her condition, coercing her into signing over the estate. They wanted everything revoked, the house, the money, all of it. I read through the papers in disbelief, my stomach churning. They weren't just trying to steal from me now. They were trying to destroy me. I hired a lawyer the next day. After reviewing the lawsuit, he leaned back in his chair and gave a dry chuckle. "This is desperate," he said, "but they're counting on you panicking. They broke into my house." I reminded him, "And now they're trying to sue me. How the hell am I supposed to not panic?" He waved a hand. "Because they have no case. They're trying to prove that your grandmother wasn't of sound mind when she changed her will. But we can prove otherwise." And he was right. Because Grandma wasn't confused. She wasn't sick. I just had to prove it. I spent the next week gathering evidence. I got statements from her doctors. Records proving she had no history of dementia or cognitive decline. I pulled up bank statements showing that she had still been managing her finances up until the very end. I even found recent emails she had sent to her accountant, confirming that she had reviewed her finances and was making her own decisions. The strongest piece of evidence came from her lawyer, the same one who had handled her estate. He had met with her personally when she changed her will. And when he was called in to testify, he was crystal clear. She was sharp as ever, he said. Completely competent. She knew exactly what she was doing and why. My parents' lawyer tried to object, but it was useless. There was no proof of mental decline, no record of confusion, no basis for their claim. Their case fell apart. And when the final ruling came down, it was exactly what I had hoped for. The lawsuit was dismissed. The will was upheld. And my family? They were left with nothing. I could have let it end there, but I was done playing defense. I was done waiting for them to make their next move. So I made mine. I filed a restraining order against all three of them. I wanted them legally barred from coming near me, my home, or any of my property. My lawyer told me it was a long shot. Judges don't always grant them in family disputes. But after hearing about the break-in, after seeing the police report, it was approved. Effective immediately, they were legally prohibited from coming near me. If they tried, they'd be arrested. The last time I saw them was in court that day. My mother glared at me like I was the worst thing that had ever happened to her. My father refused to look at me at all. Daniel just shook his head, laughing under his breath. And then I walked away. I blocked their numbers. I deleted every trace of them from my life. I never looked back.